The most classified piece of equipment in the United States military wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a radar set. It wasn't an aircraft. It was a Bombsight, the Norden M9, a gyro-stabilized analog computing precision instrument that cost the U.S. government roughly $10,000 per unit. Bombardiers swore an oath to destroy one rather than let it fall into enemy hands. Some carried a loaded sidearm specifically for that purpose. The Norden was the reason the Army could promise a revolution in warfare, no more carpet bombing, no more leveled cities to hit a single factory. The Norden would deliver surgical precision, a bomb in a pickle barrel from 4 miles up. That was the promise. Clean, accurate, almost civilized. The United States had staked its entire strategic bombing doctrine on it. Billions of dollars in aircraft and training and crew lives depended on a single gyroscope spinning in a mahogany box. In March of 1942, a 28-year-old captain sat down in a sheet metal shop at Eglin Field, Florida, and designed something better. It cost 20 cents. His name was C. Ross Greening. And almost nobody knows who he is. Every history book covers the Doolittle Raid, 16 B-25 medium bombers launched from an aircraft carrier 4 months after Pearl Harbor, straight at the Japanese home islands, the most audacious military strike of the Second World War. Doolittle got the Medal of Honor. His men became legends. What those books don't tell you is that the entire mission almost didn't happen, not because of the Japanese, not because of the weather, because of the Bombsight. And the man who solved it in a week was a fine arts graduate from Washington State who almost nobody's heard of. Carroll, Iowa, 1914. Charles Ross Greening, he went by Ross, grew up the son of a banker. When the bank failed in 1925, the family moved west to Tacoma, Washington. Greening was 11 years old and spent his adolescence drawing everything around him. He drew machinery, buildings, landscapes, faces, anything with geometry or structure. He had an eye for the way things were actually put together. He enrolled at Washington State College in 1932 and graduated 4 years later with a bachelor's degree in fine arts. He was also an ROTC, which meant he graduated with a commission. The artist and the soldier were the same man from day one. He earned his pilot wings at Kelly Field, Texas in June 1937. Spent the next 4 years flying pursuit and bombardment missions up the Pacific coast. Long patrols, primarily out of Pendleton Field in Oregon, hours over cold gray ocean. He wasn't distinguished. He wasn't famous. He was a very good pilot who happened to be able to draw. By December 1941, Greening was flying B-25 Mitchell medium bombers with the 17th Bombardment Group. A few weeks later, he received an unusual request: volunteers for a special project. No further details provided. He volunteered. The man behind the special project was Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle. The project: launch medium bombers off a Navy carrier deck and strike the Japanese home islands, something the Army Air Force's own manual said couldn't be done. There were 2 problems nobody had solved, 2 that were going to end the mission before it ever left the deck. Problem 1, the Norden. The Norden was engineered for 15,000 to 25,000 feet, long, level bomb runs where it had 30 seconds or more to spin its gyros, read airspeed, compute wind drift and ballistics, and hand a course correction to the pilot. At 1,500 feet and 250 miles per hour, the bomb reaches the ground in under 10 seconds. The gyros never finish converging. The math the Norden was built to do becomes irrelevant. At that altitude, the Norden was useless, but the Norden wasn't just useless. It was irreplaceable. Losing one over Japan, one of the most tightly held secrets in the American arsenal, could have handed Tokyo a roadmap to the entire American bombing program. Doolittle's orders were unambiguous. Strip every Norden from every aircraft before they left the carrier. Problem 2, the tail. The B-25B's lower Bendix turret had been pulled out to make room for an extra fuel tank. The rear of the aircraft had a fairing where defensive guns were supposed to be. 16 bombers were going to fly over Japan's home islands with open rear quarters and nothing to shoot back with. Eglin Field, March 1942. The crews were learning to heave a 31,000-pound airplane off the length of a carrier deck, something no B-25 had ever been designed to do. A Navy lieutenant named Hank Miller was teaching them the technique. War emergency power, locked brakes, full flaps, 3/4 back elevator. Release. The aircraft would stagger off the end of the runway, sometimes with feet to spare, sometimes with almost nothing, and climb away. They practiced this dozens of times. The ocean doesn't have runways. The clock was running. Greening was armament officer for the entire 16 aircraft operation. The Norden problem was his. The tail problem was his. He had roughly 3 weeks. The stakes couldn't have been clearer. If the raid failed because of bad bombing, because 16 B-25s flew over Japan and couldn't hit anything without a Norden, the whole mission would have been worse than a failure. It would have been a humiliation. Pearl Harbor had just happened. The country needed to believe the war could be won. He walked into the sheet metal shop at Eglin Field. He had a pencil, some drafting paper, and a fine arts degree from Washington State College. He sat down and started drawing. The gyros were computing variables that barely moved at low altitude. You didn't need a computer. You needed geometry. What he designed were 2 flat pieces of aluminum, one horizontal, a graduated arc, roughly 7 inches across, that mounted directly onto the Norden's existing bracket. One vertical, an angled plate that set the bomb release angle based on altitude and speed. At the rear, a V-notch sight and a front post, like a rifle sight, for a bomber. When the target crossed the post, the bombardier pulled the release. That was it. No gyros, no analog computer, no $10,000 of precision instrument. At 1,500 feet and 250 miles per hour, the bomb's trajectory is simple enough geometry that you don't need a computer. You need the right angle and a good eye. Greening, the fine arts graduate, had both. Working with Staff Sergeant Edwin Bain, Greening fabricated the design in metal. Then he made 15 more. Every aircraft got one, 16 handmade instruments, each one cut from the same template, each one fitted by hand. The Army's most secret weapon replaced by something a metalworker could make in an afternoon. They ran bombing tests with it. The results were so good that Doolittle included them in his classified after-action report. But that report hadn't been written yet. In March of 1942, what Greening had was a drawing and a theory. The real test was still 3 weeks away, over the Japanese home islands, at speed, under fire, with 16 aircraft and 80 men depending on whether the geometry held. He called it the Mark Twain. On the Mississippi River, riverboat leadsmen called out water depths as they sounded ahead of the bow. By the Mark Twain, 2 fathoms, 12 feet, the minimum safe depth. Barely enough water to keep from running aground. Greening named his bombsight after the minimum safe water, a deliberate joke about answering a $10,000 precision instrument with a device that was barely enough. The fine arts major had designed the most effective low-altitude bomb-aiming device in the American arsenal, and he named it like a punchline. He still had the tail problem. The rear of every aircraft was open. He needed something that looked like a gun to Japanese fighter pilots closing from the rear at 300 miles per hour. He got 2 broomsticks. He painted them the same flat black as a .50 caliber barrel and mounted them in the tail cone of every aircraft. From astern, from the angle of any Japanese fighter pilot trying to line up a shot, they looked exactly like twin 50s. 1 man, 3 weeks, 2 improvised solutions, a precision bomb aiming instrument and a fighter deterrent, both built from materials that cost less than a newspaper. All 16 aircraft, April 18, 1942. The task force was 650 miles east of Japan when a Japanese picket boat spotted them. The raid was supposed to launch at dusk. Instead, Admiral Halsey ordered, "Launch now," in broad daylight, more than 150 miles short of the planned departure point. Doolittle's aircraft went first. Then, one by one, 15 more B-25s fought their way off the pitching deck. Among them, Greening's Crew 11 aboard the Harikari Air, 500 miles at wave-top height to avoid Japanese radar. The Pacific heaving beneath them, wave crests close enough to see, close enough to feel the spray. Then a climb at the coast, a turn north toward Yokohama. The entire Japanese home island defense had been oriented around the assumption that any attack would come from altitude. Nobody had prepared for this. The planned bomb run altitude was 1,500 feet. Greening came in at 600 feet, 1,000 feet below the planned minimum, low enough that the crew could make out the details of what they were hitting. 4 500-pound incendiary clusters came off the bomb bay in sequence, each one a canister of 128 submunitions. The Mark Twain, 2 pieces of bent aluminum, 20 cents, did exactly what it was designed to do. Japanese fighters attacked from astern. Sergeant Gardner in the waist position is credited with at least 1 shoot-down. The broomstick tail guns may have bought them a few extra seconds on the run-out. Then they turned for China. 6 weeks after the raid, Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle submitted his official after-action report. In it, he wrote, the classified military report filed in June 1942, actual low-altitude bombing tests carried out at 1,500 feet showed a greater degree of accuracy with this simplified sight than we were able to obtain with the Norden. The 20-cent Bombsight outperformed the $10,000 one. Doolittle also wrote in the same document, Captain Greening deserves special commendation for the design of this sight. That sentence existed in a classified file for years before it became part of the public record. The Army knew. They put it in writing. And the world kept crediting the raid to Doolittle, to the pilots, to the daring, without ever asking who solved the problem that made it possible. Greening came home to a DFC pinned on him by General Hap Arnold in Washington. He was 28 years old and had just outsmarted the Army's most classified weapon with scrap aluminum and a riverboat joke. He went back to war. By late 1942, he was in North Africa, flying B-26 Marauder missions with the 17th Bombardment Group over Tunisia. He earned the Silver Star in January 1943, leading a flak-savaged formation through 5 German fighters without fighter escort of his own, and getting his men home. July 17, 1943. His B-26 took a direct flak hit over Naples harbor. He ordered his crew out and was last to go. He took a bullet through his leg on the way down, dislocated a hip, and sprained both ankles on landing. When he finally looked up to find his bearings, he realized he'd just missed the crater of Mount Vesuvius by what he later described as yards. The volcano was in its long pre-eruption active phase. Its famous March 1944 eruption, which would destroy dozens of Allied aircraft on the ground, was still 8 months away. Italian soldiers picked him up, fractured, shot, and confused, and put him in a camp. When Italy surrendered in September 1943, the Germans took over. They loaded Greening onto a prison transport train. Allied bombers blew up the train. Greening was blown out of the carriage and spent the next 6 months evading through northern Italy with the help of Italian partisans, part of that time hiding in a mountain cave in the hills of Friuli with 2 New Zealand POWs. German soldiers recaptured him in March 1944. He was sent to Stalag Luft I on the Baltic coast of Germany. At Stalag Luft I, he became a senior officer and did what he'd always done. He drew. He taught art classes to the other prisoners. He drew the barracks, the guard towers, the wire, the faces of men who were trying to stay human when everything around them was engineered to make them forget how. He captured what it looked like when a man received a Red Cross package, what it looked like when he didn't. He filled hundreds of sketches and watercolors, documenting a world that most survivors would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. He was liberated when the Red Army arrived in May 1945. His paintings were hidden in his gear. They came home with him. Ross Greening died on March 29, 1957, on active duty at Bethesda Naval Hospital. He was 43 years old. He was buried at Arlington. His memoir, illustrated with his own paintings and drawings, the artwork he'd made in caves and prison camps and the back rooms of barracks blocks, sat unpublished for 44 years. His widow Dorothy and his niece Karen Morgan Driscoll finally brought it out through Washington State University Press in 2001. He never got to see it in print. His A2 jacket is in the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force at Wright-Patterson. His bombsight, the Mark Twain, didn't survive the war. Every aircraft that carried one was lost the same day it was used. What exists are replicas in 3 museums, and one sentence in a classified 1942 document that says it was more accurate than the Norden. They gave the Norden its own security oath, its own destruction protocol, $10,000 per copy, a secret they guarded with pistols. A 28-year-old with a fine arts degree and some scrap metal built something better. In 3 weeks, in a sheet metal shop in Florida. Doolittle put it in the official record 6 weeks after the raid, not in a memoir, not in an interview. In the classified report, he got the commendation, and then history forgot him. Now you know.